a little hoarse. I certainly hope you endorse me, especially since I don't have a primary opponent. and not to endorse me with no primary opponent would be an interesting statement. In any event, let me talk a few minutes about some of the things I've done and about some of the issues ahead of us. I don't have to tell you about the big issues ahead of us. Let me mention a few things I've done. I mean, you know that I led the impeachment of President Trump twice. You know that Congress enacted the 117th Congress, the last 2 years, 2021-22, will probably go down in history along with the 1965-66 and 1933-36 bi-sessions as historical in what we accomplished. I don't have to name all those things. Let me name a few things specifically. In the Inflation Reduction Act, we provided a lot of funding for infrastructure, not just for infrastructure. Well, we passed the Infrastructure Act for that. The Inflation Reduction Act, we did a lot for the climate. In the Inflation Reduction, in the Infrastructure Act, we passed a lot for infrastructure. $20 billion has come to New York, or is coming to New York, I should say, for the extension of the Second Avenue subway, the rail freight tunnel, which is my particular baby for many years, the Interrail Express, and the Gateway, of course, the Gateway tunnels. Now, let me mention a couple things that I was particularly involved in. You know that we have fought for abortion for many years. You know what the Supreme Court has done. I was afraid of what the Supreme Court might do. So back in 2006, I introduced the Freedom of Choice Act, which codifies would codify the right to abortion, regardless of what the Supreme Court does. We've renamed it the Women's Health Act, sponsored now by Judy Chu and myself and a lot of other people. We're trying to pass it. I did pass 2 bills in the last session of Congress that I'm particularly proud of. One was the Respect for Marriage Act, which I wrote back in 2010. Again, regardless, this was before Obergefell, before Windsor. Mm-hmm. This codifies the right to same-sex marriage. And we passed it into law last year. At the end of last year, we passed it into law. So again, now in the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe, Justice Thomas pointed out, quite correctly, that the rationale for that decision would also call into question both the would also call into question both the gay rights decision and both would call into question the rationale for the Obergefell decision, the rationale for the Lawrence decision, which is to say same-sex sex, and would also, although he didn't point this out for some reason, call into question the Loving decision, which provides for interracial marriage. I wonder why he didn't point that out, but the Justice Thomas in his concurring opinion. So my bill, which I introduced a number of years ago, the Respect for Marriage Act, passed and codifies the respect for the right to same-sex marriage, regardless of what the Supreme Court may do. I also, after 10 years, passed into law the Pregnant Women's Fairness Act. Now, there's a little background here. As you all know, pregnant women and postpartum women, for that matter, have certain limitations on what they can do. They can't lift heavy weights. They may have to take more frequent bathroom breaks. They may have to drink more water. And they shouldn't have to choose between their job and their health and the health of their pregnancy. So in 1978, Congress sought to address this by passing PRENDA, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which said that an employer could not discriminate against a pregnant woman. Problem was, our wonderful Supreme Court interpreted that to mean that if an employer treated his non-pregnant employees well, he had to treat his pregnant employees well. But if he treated his non-pregnant employees like dirt, he could treat his pregnant employees like dirt. So that didn't help. So I introduced in 2012 the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which I modeled on the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. In fact, I took the language word for word from it. And it says that an employer must make a reasonable accommodation to the needs of a pregnant or postpartum employee, provided that such reasonable accommodation doesn't present an undue burden to the employer. And we have 30 years of judicial interpretation as to exactly what those words mean. And I introduced this bill back in 2012. It was signed into law in December of last year and went into effect in December of 2022, and went into effect in June of last year. So, these are some things. Now, of course, as you know, as chairman of Judiciary, we passed a lot of things through committee and through the House, which did not get through the Senate because of the filibuster. Anti-gun legislation, one gun law did pass, a very important gun law, but universal background checks did not pass, a ban on assault rifles did not pass, and by the way, if you watch the Swazi campaign, his opponent said she was opposed to automatic weapons. Mm-hmm. Automatic weapons are machine guns, which have been illegal since 1934. I don't know if she was deliberately out this way, to know the difference between that and a semi-automatic weapon, which is an assault rifle. So we passed in the committee and in the House, I should say, we passed an assault weapons ban, universal background checks, red flag laws, so that people who are unstable don't have possession of guns, and their family members can, or someone who observes them, can go to court and get an injunction. We passed all this, but they didn't pass into law because of the Senate filibuster. Now, I am certainly hopeful that we will keep the majority, that we will, I should say, regain the majority in the House, keep the majority in the Senate without Manchin and Sinema, and hopefully the Senate will then repeal the filibuster so that we can get things done. Now, the Senate is an undemocratic enough institution because it was designed that way by the Founding Fathers. I said Founding Fathers because they all were men. Women had no role in this, obviously, but the Founding Fathers designed the Senate to be unrepresentative, 2 senators for each state, regardless of population. They didn't provide for a filibuster. The filibuster was invented by John C. Calhoun to protect slavery and was kept on in protecting Jim Crow. And it was never used except on civil rights legislation until about 20 years ago. Suddenly they started using it on everything, and all of a sudden you see that a vote in the Senate requires 60 votes. That was never true until 20 years ago, except on civil rights legislation, which was bad enough. Hopefully they will abolish, hopefully the Democratic majority in the Senate, without Manchin and filibuster, without Manchin and Sinema, I should say, who prevented repeal of the filibuster, will now repeal the filibuster. I should mention one other bill that another bill I'm sponsoring, which is the MORE Act, marijuana. What was our acronym? Marijuana is something I forget. What this would do is to deschedule. Now, the president has recently proposed removing marijuana from Schedule 1, which is together with heroin and opium, and putting it in Schedule 3. The MORE Act would deschedule marijuana entirely, would put a tax on it, would expunge the criminal records of everyone convicted in the past of violations of marijuana law, would put a tax on the marijuana and use that to help communities, which is basically communities of color that were particularly impacted by the marijuana laws. I'll mention another bill.
It's the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment
You got
and
it.
Expungement Act.
That's
So
what I said,
you could
expunge.
do for it.
That's what I said, expunge the records. I also should mention that I have a bill which hopefully we'll be able to pass, although not in this Congress, but in the next Congress, on generic drugs. Now, you know that as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, we got insulin down to $35 a month for people on Medicare. Medicare was given the ability to negotiate drug prices, not totally, but 10 drugs a year increasing. I support Medicare for all, which is, not just for senior citizens. But one problem we've had with generic drugs. Now, the way that works normally is you have a patent on a drug. The patent, you can charge whatever you want while you have the patent, and you do. You charge a very high price for that drug until the patent expires. When the patent expires, anyone can manufacture the drug, and we have a whole generic drug industry where other companies come and sell it generically, and that brings the price down, and you have to bring the price down to whatever that is. Unless you, the original patent holder, make a deal with the generic drug companies in which you will pay them off not to market the drug at the lower price. This is done now. It's legal. My bill would make it illegal. So that's some of what's going on. I don't have to tell you the stakes in the election overall. Every election we say that this is the most important election ever. And usually it is. This one is the most important election since 1860. In 1860, the fate of democracy in our country was at stake. Now, the fate of democracy in our country is at stake, quite literally. I haven't mentioned foreign policy, but that's at stake too. So I'll leave it there and answer questions.